to the A-10 Warthog for nearly 50 years, but that run as the primary mission here at DM for the Warthog is coming to an end.
In the blistering heat of Yemen's deserts, an old war machine roars back to life. The A-10 Warthog, armed with its devastating 30mm cannon and unmatched persistence, is hunting down missile teams and crushing enemy tactics with ruthless precision. How long can the enemy survive under its relentless gaze? A harsh wind and a long-awaited return. Beneath a punishing sun at Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates, a swarm of ground crews bustled around a formation of drab gray aircraft on the morning of March 29, 2025. The wind slicing across the runway lifted granules of sand that twirled through the air, glinting momentarily in the bright light. In that coarse swirl stood the A-10 Thunderbolt II, long nicknamed the Warthog, a low-flying, heavily armored relic in the eyes of some, yet revered as a battle-hardened savior by others. For the past 3 years, the A-10 had been largely absent from major combat. Defense debates back in the States insisted that times were changing. The future belonged to stealth fighters and unmanned drones, not old-school brutes with giant cannons. Many outside observers considered the Warthog's days numbered, but that sweltering day in March told a different story. The 124th Fighter Wing had arrived, accompanied by 300 support personnel from the 190th Fighter Squadron, and every bolt, panel, and rivet on those aircraft shone with renewed purpose. Their mission, while not proclaimed in grand speeches or parades, carried extraordinary importance. In Yemen, a conflict smoldered, with Houthi fighters refining a lethal tactic of rolling hidden missile launchers out from caves, firing at U.S. or Allied ships in the Red Sea, and then melting back under layers of rock. These so-called shoot-and-scoot maneuvers were no mere rumor. Intelligence had recorded near misses several times over the past months. The Navy patrolling the sea lanes felt besieged by an invisible threat, capable of emerging from Yemen's coast in an instant. Against such a menace, the slow-breathing, heavily armored Warthog offered one precious advantage: it could linger. Inside a cool briefing room at Al Dhafra, swarms of intelligence officers pinned maps of Yemen's mountainous regions up and down the walls. They'd circled suspected caves, noted flat patches of rock used as improvised staging points, and color-coded each known Houthi stronghold. The speculation was that Iranian advisors had taught the insurgents how to hide missile launchers behind camouflage tarps, disguised in battered trucks that traveled along dirt roads at dawn or dusk. If an enemy plane soared by too fast, the chance of spotting these hidden assets dropped to nearly zero. But an A-10 flying slow and methodical, scanning every ridge and ravine with infrared pods, might actually catch them in time. The deeper problem was that the Houthis had a pipeline of weapons. They also possessed older Soviet or Iranian radars that, while technologically dated, could still detect unguarded flights and potentially guide bursts of ground fire. The A-10 is no stranger to ground fire, but it's hardly indestructible. Pilots needed to be mindful of the possibility of heavier calibers aimed from ridges or camouflage guns. For that reason, the Navy sent in EA-18G Growlers, electronic warfare jets known to jam and deactivate radars. On day one, as the sun crawled overhead, the humming of technicians and the murmur of pilots created a tense orchestra. Crews tested the monstrous 30mm GAU-8A cannon that stretched along the Warthog's belly, each barrel loaded with tungsten or depleted uranium shells. Others prepped missile rails for AGM-65 Mavericks and triple-checked the pods that would identify targets from tens of miles away. All the while, a desert wind tugged at the flight line, swirling so strongly that some enlisted airmen had to shield their faces from miniature sandstorms. No press conferences or medal ceremonies heralded the Warthog's arrival, but the ground crews, the intelligence teams, and the overhead watchers knew that March 29th marked a turning point in this shadow war. The Houthis had gotten used to quick, partial retaliation that never quite pinned them down. Now the U.S. was pivoting to a method of endless overwatch, hoping to catch the insurgents in the fleeting seconds they emerged to unleash a missile. It felt as though the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if that menacing silhouette of the Warthog might tilt the scales in ways few had dared to imagine. Of caves and cannons, why the Warthog matters. For ages, storms in Middle Eastern conflicts have swept across seemingly unremarkable deserts, only for the local fighters to vanish into labyrinths of stone. Yemen's mountainous backbone is no exception. The Houthis carved out hideouts and concealments in cratered ridges that, from the sky, appeared as uniform patterns of rock. That's how they thrived, rolling an old truck with a missile rail out of a tunnel for a minute or two, firing a short-range missile, and then disappearing with the speed of a ghost. Over time, they grew bold enough to threaten not just local adversaries, but also ships passing through the Red Sea. In the face of that cunning, the A-10 brought an arsenal of unique traits. The plane's design famously puts the pilot inside a titanium bathtub, able to survive hits that would compromise more fragile fighters. Its wings are wide and blunt, meant for stable, low-altitude flight, making it easier to spot a hidden threat on the ground. And at its core is a giant rotating cannon system that dwarfs anything comparable in modern jets. One short burst can fling hundreds of armor-piercing rounds in seconds, effectively mowing down tanks, bunkers, or missile launchers. Yet in Yemen, the target is not an army lined up in the open. The enemy is a shapeshifter, sometimes a small group of men wearing sandals, at other times a ragtag unit with improvised vehicles that vanish behind a ridge once they pulled the trigger. So the Warthog's slow flight speed and extended loiter time become an enormous advantage. It can linger for over an hour if armed with just internal fuel, or far longer if it meets a KC-135 tanker midair. Once up there, using a high-resolution targeting pod, the pilot can pick out a warm truck engine or an odd-shaped canvas tarp among the rocks. The cost of that advantage, however, is increased exposure. At speeds around 300 knots in a typical orbit, the Warthog is vulnerable to ground fire. This is why the synergy with electronic warfare aircraft is so critical. If any radar site tries to guide anti-air guns onto the A-10, a Growler can saturate the frequency with disruptive signals, blinding the enemy. Newly arrived at Al-Dhafra, pilots and intelligence teams discovered the Houthis had also gained a leg up in communications. Iranian advisors apparently supplied them with satellite-based internet, courtesy of Starlink terminals, ensuring the fighters could coordinate long-range shots. This surprised many who expected a less advanced setup, but it also placed a bright target on the Houthis' communications channels, all of which were being surveilled by American signals experts. Whenever a phone call or data burst referenced a launch time, it became feasible to vector in a Warthog on short notice. Still, the plan was simmered in tension. The desert night could hide a lot of sins. The Houthis might mask heat signatures or wait for the brief lull between A-10 patrols. For the Warthog's mission planners, the trick was to keep a constant presence, rotating jets so that a gap never emerged. Over the radio nets, pilots joked that the desert land beyond the runway was the lion's den, a place where one misstep could mean a surprise rocket up the belly. Yet each joked while meticulously checking flight suits, survival gear, and the beastly 30mm rounds. They understood that the next scramble might be unstoppable once it began. Such a scenario was exactly what would unfold a few days later, when intelligence picked up urgent chatter of a planned Houthi missile strike. The question then was how fast the Warthogs could cross the distance to Yemen and whether they'd arrive in time. For all the plane's might and protection, it does not zip across the sky like a supersonic fighter. Those final minutes of the chase would be everything. April 1st, a mad dash to stop a launch. That morning dawned without warning signs. The scorching sun was already punishing the tarmac. A pair of A-10s had launched on a routine patrol, scanning for anything out of place along the dusty ridgelines of Yemen. Overhead, an RC-135 rivet joint soared in slow circles, eavesdropping on phone lines and radio frequencies. Suddenly, the content of a captured phone call sent waves of urgency through the command centers. A Houthi squad was preparing to roll a launcher out in less than 20 minutes, evidently planning to aim at a U.S. or Allied vessel crossing a critical shipping channel. The Americans had mere minutes to respond before that missile took flight, and if it launched, there was a non-trivial chance it could inflict serious cost, whether by sheer hit or forcing a ship to maneuver in panic. At that second, the A-10 patrol was some distance away, too far for a normal width of the map dash. But the pilots got a direct order to push their throttles to the limit. The planes, never known for high speed, rumbled forward, hugging the ground to reduce detection. Meanwhile, the intelligence staff transmitted coordinates to the Warthog cockpits, pinpointing which rocky valley the Houthis planned to use. The flight in those next 15 to 18 minutes felt like a breathless race. The lead pilot periodically glanced down at the digital map, verifying headings. The desert terrain shifted from rolling dunes to hard stone slopes, and the lightning pod zeroed in on what looked like a small group of figures near a half-open cave. Zooming in, the pilot saw what suspiciously resembled a tall launch tube, tilted at an angle. It was exactly the sort of contraption used for anti-ship missiles. Time was practically splintering into seconds, so the pilot, risking potential ground fire, angled the Warthog into a direct approach. At about 6,500 meters, they engaged the cannon. The GAU-8 roared with a savage brrrt, sending a cascade of metal that shredded the launcher, the truck, and any associated gear in a storm of sparks and dust. The second A-10, trailing close behind, took a defensive pattern, scanning for muzzle flashes that might signal a hidden anti-air gun. Later, testimonies from those who observed the strike described it as a fierce, sudden whirlwind. One moment, a team of fighters stood around a truck, preparing for the kill shot. The next, a hail of 30mm shells tore the scene apart. For the Americans, it was confirmation that their layered intelligence could indeed pay off. For the Houthis, it was a horrifying sign that the old, lumbering Warthog was not so easily outfoxed. By the tops of that day's debrief, everyone realized it was more than a simple victory. The narrow margin of success, arriving within mere minutes, proved that if the U.S. maintained a vigilant watch, the Houthis couldn't reliably fire a missile without risking an immediate lethal response. That single event kicked off a pattern that would keep repeating across the next weeks, turning Yemen's mountainous edges into a lethal hide-and-seek arena. Jammed radars and April 2's triple kill. If the Houthis expected to learn from the April 1st fiasco, they moved quickly. Reports circulated about them trying to power up older radars. Perhaps they figured advanced warning would help them detect the Warthogs, giving time to duck back into caves. The next day, intelligence flagged a new concentration of trucks northeast of Ceuta, an area historically tied to Houthi strongholds. This time, the Americans took no chances with potential radars. The Navy mobilized EA-18G Growlers, jets that specialized in hacking and jamming enemy signals. Within minutes, Growler pilots located the frequency band for the Houthi radars and unleashed blasts of electromagnetic energy. That onslaught was enough to either disable or scramble the screens, rendering them worthless. While the Houthis fumbled with their jammed electronics, two Warthogs slid into the scene. Their targeting pod zoomed in on 3 trucks, each suspiciously shaped like a missile launcher. One group scrambled to cover a launcher with a tarp, but it was too late. In a measured tone, the lead A-10 pilot fired an AGM-65 Maverick from about 26 miles away, ensuring a standoff strike that neutralized the main launcher. The fiery blast from the missile set off secondary explosions, presumably from stored ordnance. Shrapnel tore through the other 2 trucks. A few fighters piled into a battered pickup, hoping to vanish into the maze of dust-choked trails. The trailing A-10 selected the gun and stitched the truck with a succinct burst of shells, leaving it immobile. Over overhead radio channels, the pilot's voice was clipped, but exultant. 3 launchers destroyed, no sign of return fire. For the Houthis, it was a rude awakening that older radar sets wouldn't provide them a bubble of security, and they started to realize how thoroughly the Americans had knitted together intelligence, jamming, and direct strike capabilities. The possibility of sneaking out to lob a missile was shrinking, yet the Americans knew better than to assume it would be this easy forever. Yemen's rugged environment gave the Houthis plenty of places to hunker down, and Iranian advisors might still pass along fresh tricks to circumvent jammers. But for that day, the synergy between Growlers and Warthogs had delivered a symbolic blow. because neither the Houthis nor their radars saw the A-10s coming until it was far too late. The desert shifts, tension mounts by mid-April. Within a week, radio intercepts suggested the Houthis recognized a new paradigm. They had encountered Western air power before, but the presence of the A-10 dramatized it. Usually after a missile launch, an insurgent group might expect at least a short delay before a retaliation. Now it seemed the retaliation arrived almost instantly, so they adapted. IRGC members advised them to reduce open phone communications, revert to line-of-sight signals, or bury cables if possible. Some craftspeople among them worked on building decoys, wooden frames covered by tarps designed to look like truck beds or missile tubes. Others scoured local black markets for spare camouflage netting that might conceal engine heat. And the Warthog crews kept refining their tactics in response. The lightning pods could detect small temperature differentials. If the decoy was stone cold, it would stand out against a scorching background in ways the Americans learned to watch for. If a net was used, the pilot might notice the distinct shape, or better yet, watch from overhead for actual movement that gave the real truck away. During daily briefings, intelligence officers pinned new photos on the walls, possible signature changes the Houthis tried to implement. Meanwhile, signals specialists recorded phone calls that sounded more and more paranoid as local fighters realized the Americans could hear them. By April 10th, there was a glaring sign that the Houthis were pulling their heavy launchers back from the immediate coast. No one in the U.S. command post cheered too loudly, though. A single cunning ambush that slipped through the net could still do massive damage to a tanker or warship. It wasn't only about missiles either. Helicopter overflights discovered big holes in certain ridges that might hide more advanced weapons. The Americans took note that if the Houthis ever got hold of stronger anti-air systems, low-flying planes like the A-10 could face trouble. Yet for the moment, the digital warfare from the Growlers neutralized many threats. Deterring radar usage was half the battle for the Warthog to keep operating. In the field, each A-10 pilot swapped stories of their near misses with ground fire. Several had taken a few dings in the plane's armor, bouncing off or leaving shallow dents. Maintaining calm in the face of tracer rounds was part of the job. A handful of times, local technical trucks, a machine gun attached to a pickup, fired pot shots at A-10s overhead. The Warthog pilots typically responded with either short gun runs or a single well-placed bomb. Rarely did those technicals remain an issue afterward. As the second week of April approached, trackers saw a measurable drop in missile attempts from Yemen's coast. Macroeconomic shipping data revealed that fewer cargo vessels demanded armed escorts. Navy watch officers lowered their alert level from red to yellow in certain corridors. Yet the story was far from over. The Houthis, known for unpredictability, might be planning a bigger push or waiting for a day when no A-10 was near enough. Indeed, on April 13th, one such instance arose, painting the sky with fresh sparks of violence. April 13th, a deadly drone, tip in the Hammer Falls. On a blistering mid-afternoon, a U.S. drone glided over Jawf province. It picked up a stark thermal reading, a truck parked near farmland, engine hot. That might seem routine in many places, but according to local patterns, farmers often used older, smaller vehicles. This truck had the heavy chassis typical of missile-bearing rigs, so a message zipped back to a patrolling A-10 that had recently refueled in midair. The pilot banked left, trading altitude for speed, and glided toward a ridgeline that gave partial cover from small arms below. The lightning pod saw a group of men fussing around a tall, cylindrical shape. From overhead, it became clear, a missile tube, likely a C-802, with a truck positioned for a launch. No sign of an active radar, though. The pilot suspected the Houthis feared turning one on, worried about meeting the wrath of jamming Growlers. Within a breath, the pilot locked the first Maverick missile onto the truck's silhouette. Jumping to the input on the console, the pilot steadied the crosshairs, pressed the release, and watched as the missile streaked into the gloom. An eruption of dirt, rock, and flame consumed the launcher, setting off secondary blasts from the warhead inside. Shreds of steel and debris fanned out in a lethal arc. At least one of the men bolted to another truck, retreating in blind panic. The A-10 pilot, still keyed up, switched to the cannon. A short, precise trigger pull spat 2 seconds of 30mm fury. That was enough. Through the swirling dust, the pilot glimpsed the second truck's twisted hull. It would go nowhere. Later analysis of drone footage showed how swiftly it all happened. The Houthis had evidently planned to fire within minutes, but they never got that chance. For an insurgent cell that prided itself on ambushing unsuspecting ships, it was an overdue shock. The circle of watchers that the Americans had built, drone recon, jam-proof communications, a Warthog on station, all knitted together in real time, proved unstoppable in that instant. This pattern repeated in the nights following. Sometimes the pilot found only fleeting glimpses of possible threats. Other times, the Houthi lines were completely silent, forcing the A-10 to orbit, scanning the desert, occasionally glimpsing star-studded skies above. Meanwhile, the drone operators peered at black and white infrared feeds, searching for anything that might reveal a hidden rocket or its heat signature. Shows of force and urban entanglements. Though the advantage sat with the Americans in open desert, complications abounded in city outskirts or small towns. The Houthis, knowing the U.S. typically took great care to avoid harming civilians, sometimes moved their gear closer to populated zones. It was a twisted game. Hide among innocent people, hoping the Warthogs wouldn't risk a direct strike. In these scenarios, a tactic known as show of force proved crucial. Picture a looming A-10 diving low, turbines shrieking, sometimes releasing flare after flare in the twilight. Bright, rapid pulses of light. On the ground, such a pass feels like doomsday creeping overhead. Often, Houthi fighter crews, not eager to gamble with the Warthog's real fire, panicked and abandoned their gear. Civilians also ran for cover, though most recognized the difference between a feint and an actual strafing run the instant the plane pulled away without firing. These dramatic passes aimed at scattering the insurgents so they couldn't mount a precise launch. The pilot might then circle around, waiting to see if the launcher reappeared in a more isolated area. If it did, the Warthog had the green light to strike. While not guaranteed to solve every urban standoff, these shows of force were a psychological blow, reminding the Houthis that the plane overhead saw them, and that real firepower could follow if they didn't retreat. Pilots admitted it was nerve-wracking to drop so low over unknown territory. Stray machine guns or rocket-propelled grenades could strike from hidden corners, but the A-10's titanium armor offered mental comfort. Historical precedents from earlier wars indicated that a Warthog could sustain hits and still limp back, so the plane thundered on, delivering fear without lethal bombs in areas where bystanders might otherwise get caught in the crossfire. Over time, intelligence tallies showed that each show of force in a congested zone often delayed or outright ceased a Houthi attempt. Some took advantage of the confusion to mass themselves among civilians. Others gave up for the day, opting to find a new hideout. Either way, the net effect was fewer missile shots. And each time the Houthis flubbed a launch, the Red Sea shipping lanes breathed a sigh of relief. An ebb in the sound of missiles. By mid-April, the data was hard to dispute. Houthi missile attempts dropped sharply. Navy officers used to scanning radar screens for incoming threats noted that the red alerts had dramatically declined. Insurance rates for commercial tankers dipped. Some shipping companies began allowing their vessels to sail past Yemeni waters without heavy escorts, something they hadn't done in months. Quietly, with no media fanfare, the A-10 had reshaped the environment. Intelligence blamed a combination of factors, from jammed radars to phone intercepts that sniffed out each potential shot, to Warthogs constantly overhead. Among the 190th Fighter Squadron's pilots at Al Dhafra, the morale soared. They swapped stories of how they'd become desert guardians, vigilantly hovering across the border, anticipating whatever illusions the Houthis tried to muster next. Numbers from Central Command painted the scoreboard. Between April 2nd and April 17th, the A-10s had flown well over 200 sorties. They chalked up nearly 50 launcher kills, and a handful of high-profile Houthi field commanders also struck in these engagements. Many watchers inside the chain of command hailed it as proof that an old airframe, when blended with up-to-the-minute intel, could still wreak havoc on enemy plans. Marine officers took an interest in how easily the Warthog integrated into naval operations. Despite not being a Navy aircraft, the A-10 had a knack for preventing literal threats. something that might have been wholly outside its original design scope. Meanwhile, those who advocated for retiring the Warthog found themselves on shakier ground. Sure, there were arguments about the cost of modernization, but the raw success rate was tough to ignore. Ship captains reported a tangible relief. Sailors who once fretted non-stop about incoming missile alerts were now sending calmer updates. No radar lock detected, no sign of movement from the coastline. Cargo captains that had shunned the corridor began rerouting back through, cutting days off their journeys. The operations might have been overshadowed by bigger news in other parts of the region, but for the people plying those waters, it was a sea change. Still, nobody claimed total victory. The Houthis remained a force in Yemen, controlling areas of territory and capable of sudden surprises. They just no longer had the freedom to sporadically pepper the sea with missiles. With each day that passed, more potential launchers ended up smoldering wrecks in mountain gullies. Houthi leaders now measured every attempt with dread, aware that once they fired, they had minutes, maybe less, before the A-10's vengeance arrived. The A-10's roar and the spread of its legend. Inside the ready rooms, new arrivals from the States listened wide-eyed as the pilots who'd been flying these missions recounted how the plane performed when push came to shove. Planes had come back bearing fresh scars, dents from rifle rounds or shrapnel scuffs from near hits. Maintenance crews replaced panels, wiped away caked dust, and reloaded the big gun as if it were just another day at the office. Almost every mission ended with the same refrain, a deep gratitude that the A-10's thick hide and low-speed approach turned out to be a perfect fit for flushing out hidden threats. It was a far cry from high-altitude bombers that would drop payloads without seeing a single muzzle flash below. Here, the pilot could literally see the truck scuttling, watch men scatter in confusion, and then time a shot to ensure maximum effect. That slow, methodical style of engagement, ironically, fit the hyper-adaptive cat-and-mouse game in Yemen better than anything else. The Houthis, trying to slip under normal jets' radar, found themselves face-to-face with a plane that refused to zip away. One that circled, probed, and never strayed too far. Outside the base, rumors swirled that the Houthis began calling the plane the low-flying hammer, referring to the jarring moment they realized an A-10 was overhead. Some accounts from local tribes suggested Houthi watchers would steam off on motorcycles, phone in hand whenever they realized a broad-winged aircraft approached, only to learn that jamming or intercepts cut short their warnings. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the debate on the Warthog's future flared anew. Planners who favored retiring the plane faced tough questions. If an allegedly obsolete airframe could single-handedly stifle these missile launches, then what other roles might it fill before 2029 arrived? While stealth jets were crucial in peer-level conflicts, the Yemen situation underscored that not all wars were about advanced surface-to-air networks. Some were about hidden trucks in rocky labyrinths, best fought with a relentless plane that can soak up punishment and deliver punishing blows in return. Toward the latter half of April, the fight's tempo dipped. The Houthis realized that continuous attempts had drained their resources without inflicting matching harm on U.S. or allied navies. Even so, the Americans stayed alert. Complacency was dangerous. The Warthog crews kept up their rotation. Growlers remained in range to jam anything that lit up a radar scope. Rivet joint flights kept scanning Houthi calls for hints of resurgent ambition. No cheering crowds or banners announced the shift in power, but every day of relative peace on the shipping routes offered quiet confirmation. The Warthog had carved a new legacy, proving that low and slow could still dominate the right battlefield.